To better understand the problem and the solution at hand, I need to explain how the screen shader system, actually works. So, what we have that is you usually have a shader cube, which is just a cube mesh filter with a mesh renderer on it, and you have your screen shader. Now, KKVS and I use Mochi's screen effects, but there are a few other ones, such as Leviathan's Uber shader or June 5, just to name a few. And the idea being is while you are in the range, so that's what you see this gizmo for, you can see the screen shader. So once I'm in the gizmo, you can see it, and if I'm outside the gizmo, you cannot. Now, that's good, and what we do is for the various different fluids, right, we have a range fall off. So that way, as you start to, it's kind of hard to do it in the editor, but as you are between these two ranges here, it will nicely blend between from the minimum, i.e. being an opacity of 0, to the maximum, which is an opacity of 1, as the fluids go over your head. Bear in mind, this will go up slowly with the fluids as the fluids are animated. Now, that's good and all. However, we have a problem. Let's look at this one, for example. Now, this might make sense for this current belly size, but what happens when you scale the belly? Or not that, but scale the whole belly. So we'll go and grab this right here and scale this up a bit. Now, we have a problem. The belly size is much bigger, and so are the fluids, and now not only will this not cover the entire range of the belly, it will now, the fall-offs won't make sense. They won't be matched to the fluids at all. So we would have to animate the fall-off, because we can do that, right? We can animate this fall-off, but we would have to do that in accounting for keeping the ranges close to the fluid height, as well as making sure it can cover the entire belly, which typically means that you'll have a little bit right here, but then you'll have this giant sphere at the very bottom. So the way we do that is we have, or I say we, KKVS had different depth ones. So we had a depth for each one of the stomach sizes, essentially. So with 0 being the smallest size, and then 7 being the biggest. So if we go to 7 here, we have this giant version of it. Now, that works, and for all intents and purposes, in terms of performance, at runtime, works just fine. However, because these are individual mesh renderers with different material properties, you end up having multiple different materials and henceforth material slots. Meaning when these different versions fire, it's essentially telling the renderer to load a new material when you switch the belly size. Now, that causes when you switch to a material, the shader has to be loaded, which you essentially see like a hitch. So if someone ever turns on something and you get that weird hitch for a second, it's usually because of a shader. Now, that poses a problem because this is tied to a radial wheel, right? So as you start to use your radial wheel and make the belly bigger, it's going to fire off all of these, assuming you go from 0 to 1 or like 0 to 4. And that's going to be a lot of hitching and a lot of shader loading for something that realistically we're only going to use one of those slots at a time. Additionally, although we only fire off and keep one of these on permanently at a given time, the SDK will complain because it thinks these are all different renderers, and they are, but it's assuming that you're going to have all of these on at once. So the SDK will hate you for the fact that you have too many renderers. Now, this doesn't really translate in game, but the SDK will complain about it, and your performance rank takes a huge hit because of this. And there's a better way of doing this. How do we do that? Let me show you. So, how we fix this, right, is let's assume that this box is the belly. I'm not an artist, at least not a 2D one. let's pretend the fluids are right here, and let's say your head is right here and your viewpoint's right here, right? Now, let me get a different color. Like I said, the way it typically worked is you would have the shader with this sort of like range fall off, right? That's what those gizmos said. What instead if we had a contact receiver, like a capsule one right here, that looks for a head contact, right? And we say float, and we use proximity. As the fluids start to go up and this capsule starts to get near your head here, it'll write to a parameter from 0 to 1, it being a float. So you have like 0.01 or 0.05 and so on and so forth. What we can do is we can blend the opacity of the shader cube. So we have a fixed cube around the entire belly that is constant. And as the contact reaches towards your head, we blend the opacity from 0 to 1. That basically solves part of the problem. We now don't have to worry about animating the range fall off, and we don't have to worry about accounting for the belly size as well as the fluid height, because that's what our contact receiver does. However, there is a separate problem. Now, let's pretend that your head was actually further down. It's still black. There we go. Let's say your head is right here and your viewpoint's right here, right? And at frame number 1, we have the contact receiver here and the fluids there. Now, let's assume at frame 60, for example, or about a second later, you now raise the fluids to here, right? So we're going to pretend that this is not there. Now, the contact receiver is up here. The fluids are above your head, but the distance, right? The distance between the contact receiver and your head is now greater. So although these are above your head, the opacity of the shader goes down because the distance is greater. How do we solve that? Well, we do something really funky. What I do, right, is when we have a contact receiver and it fires and it hits your head, it basically records the fluid depth. So fluid depth is a float parameter that defines how high the fluids are. So when the contact receiver is approaching its maximum, i.e. like 0.95, I believe is what I have it set to, we record the amount, we record the fluid depth to a new parameter called activated depth, which basically memorizes, hey, what was the fluid height at when we fired on the screen shader and it approached maximum? When we do that, we now have another bool parameter essentially called acid lock. And when acid depth or activation depth, is written to, we turn on acid lock. Which all you need to understand about that, right, is when acid lock is on, the opacity of the screen shader is locked to 1, right? It basically ignores the contact receiver and it locks it at 1. Such that when we activate it and it's above your head, because the fluid is locked, it ignores the distance between your head and the fluids. Now that poses a problem. How do we unlock this? How do we know when to unlock it? Well, that's where that activation depth comes in. We basically constantly, when this is above here, for example, we basically subtract the fluid depth, right, from the acid depth, such that when the fluid starts to approach, if you start to drain the fluids and it starts to go back towards your head, right, this subtraction will eventually somewhat reach 0, right? I don't make it 0, I actually make it 0.001, I believe, or something like that, but some very fine grained number. And that's how we know that, hey, the fluids are back at to where they were when we fired them off. And to completely disable the lock, what I do is when the fluids go back, right? Like I said, we have the activation depth, and we do a subtraction from the fluid depth. So as this approaches back toward your head, this subtraction equals 0, essentially. Now, what we do is once the subtraction reaches 0, we basically disable the lock, right? We disable the lock, And once the subtraction reaches like 0.2, i.e. the fluids are further down than the activation depth by a factor of like 10 or 20%, that's when we then reset this parameter right here, the activation depth. It gets set back to 0, which allows it to be reset the next time you raise the fluids. This avoids the problem of having multiple mesh renderers and accounting for different belly sizes, and it also only uses one material, and all we have to do is we just blend the opacity from 0 to 1. We don't even need to blend or change the gizmos, like the activation ranges, because they can just be big enough to encompass the entire belly, and we just use the opacity. Now, I am sure you're thinking, that's a lot of synced parameters. And it's actually not. The only synced parameter we use right here is the fluid depth. We get the proximity between your head and the fluids for free because it's a contact receiver, and we get those synced for free essentially. And this activation depth, right, that's a internal, like local only float that gets recorded, so that's not synced and is handled independently on each remote copy of the avatar. The only caveat to this, right, is late joiners. If late joiners were not here when this activation depth was recorded, this fluid shader, or the screen shader, right, will be very inaccurate, and it might fire on or might fire off completely wrong. However, that is not something I'm concerned about, because if you're late joining, you don't care about the screen shader, right? You're not in the belly, and sure, your camera, if you put it in there, you might be able to see it, but it would make the prey all blurry anyways, so it doesn't really matter. The only thing we really care about firing this off correctly for is the prey inside the belly. So this guy. So on paper, that's how it works. Let me switch over to Unity and show you it in action. Alright, so we're here in Unity now, and we have this sphere that represents the prey's head. Now, I have the parameters pulled up here, so you can see the parameters and the math being done in real time, and this is just my radial menu. So, now, acid delta is that subtraction that I was talking about. So, this float is the result of the subtraction between the fluid depth and the activation percent. So, you have this acid activated at right here, which is currently -1. That basically is that memory parameter I talked about. And acid proximity is the actual contact. So the proximity of the contact receiver to this fake head that I have here. Screen space lock, although it's a float, it basically only has two values, 0 or 1. That basically locks the fluid shader at 0% opacity or 1% opacity, respectively. So, as I bring this up, you can see that we have that proximity starting to go up, and my screen shader starts to run. And then right as we submerge the head, right, now you can see that it turned on the screen space lock because we are basically approaching our maximum. And now, as I raise the fluids more and more and more, like even if I go back some, right, you can see it activated at 0.50%, or 0.50, which is 50%. That's when we know the screen shader was fully activated. So now I can raise this as high as I want, and despite the proximity being 0, the screen shader stays on. And as I start to bring this back down, the delta starts to decrease till I get right back to 50-ish%, and it will remember that. And as I go below that, it disables the lock, and we can blend back out. And we can rinse and repeat this cycle over and over again, and it will always make sure that we don't lose the screen shader. And this is not a static position either, right? So if I take this guy and I move them higher, for example, let's move them a little bit higher here, and then do this again, now that activated at is now 60%, and you can't see this because I'm too far out, but there we go. So now it treats it the same, and as we go back down, the same thing happens. Or better yet, if I make this way lower, so let's go way down here, like even further even, let's really make them small. as I start to do this, it now activates at 35% and blends back out. And I can make this all the way up, and the contact receiver is way the hell up there, and our head is way down here, but we still get proper fluid depths and the proper screen shader, and I can lower this and blend back out. So this solves that problem. And just to kind of demonstrate, right, let's go ahead and pull up the contact receiver just to prove what I'm talking about. So here's our fluid height. So we can take this and run it up, and we know that the screen shader is on despite the contact being up there. And as we go back down, we get to see it go in and out. And we only have one screen shader. This is the one screen shader right here. We can actually see the fluid depth, or the opacity right there. So as we do this, you can see it blending in and out, and then once we go to our maximum, it jumps to 1 essentially, and make sure that it stays locked. But yeah, that is just a little retro tidbit on how I solve this problem.